Hey guys, tonight we step into the coldest chamber of history, where whispers of Charles II's walking corpse echo down the dark corridors of the Spanish palace. The image of the last Habsburg, king, his gaunt body, waxen pallor, and bulging, haunted eyes will make you feel you won't survive this. Right now you're probably scrolling on a comfy couch. But imagine peering through a spectral veil, witnessing the grotesque exorcism rites and sensing that final breath, heavy with herbal concoctions and incense. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Comment below where you're watching from and what time it is in your local zone. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the autumn of 1700, the most powerful throne in Europe belonged to Charles II of Spain, the last monarch of the Habsburg line. But his body was already that of a walking corpse. Born in 1661, he was the only surviving son of King Philip IV and Empress Mariana of Austria. His father, Philip IV, stood among Spain's most formidable rulers, extending royal influence through complex European wars, while his mother, Mariana, of Austrian blood, oversaw the Spanish crown with meticulous and austere care. From the moment of his birth, Charles II bore the size of fate. He arrived after the tragic death of his elder brother, Prince Philip Prospero, and the court's failed attempts to produce a healthy heir. Charles had several siblings, but each died in childhood, leaving him the Habsburgs' final hope. His birth marked a fragile moment. The Habsburg splendor seemed to wither from the very first breath. Throughout his childhood, he struggled against a host of physical afflictions. A cleft lip, an oversized tongue, and a receding jaw distorted his face, drawing pitying and uneasy glances. In his early years, Charles could not stand on his own. Only at the age of 8 did he tentatively learn to walk, his steps still trembling like a falling leaf. His speech did not become somewhat clear until adulthood, yet it always carried a startle and quaver, as if every word emerged from deep bodily and emotional pain. When King Philip IV died, in the year 1665, the boy Charles, only 4 years old, ascended the throne. Yet real power lay with his mother, Queen Regent Mariana, who made all decisions from the royal bedchamber. Under her protection, the court maintained the facade that Charles could shoulder the burden of empire. Despite glaring signs of illness and paralysis, portraits of him as a child, wearing a royal crown, his gaze solemn, only deepened the tragic sense of a king deprived of true agency. Politically, Charles II's reign rarely recorded any significant reforms or great military victories. Instead, clerics and courtiers focused on preserving old traditions, continuing dynastic marriages with Austrian and French houses to keep Habsburg blood pure and maintain noble loyalty. Charles II married twice, first to Marie-Louise of Orléans, then to Maria Anna of Neuburg. Yet neither queen bore him an heir. Marie-Louise's mysterious death even fueled whispers of political intrigue and power plays. Throughout his reign, Charles II left almost no mark of reform or martial success. He became instead the emblem of the tragic consequences of inbreeding congenital diseases, physical debilitation, and mental fog. Under Regent Mariana's oversight, royal advisors kept Spain's government machinery running, while Charles himself remained a figurehead, appearing only in rare court ceremonies and public festivities. Charles de Saint-Résumé Thus contained many heartbreaking details: a king on throne far too young, a body that never fully developed, a mind shrouded in confusion, and a legacy defined solely by the remnants of a decaying dynasty. The vast empire from South American jungles to the Isle of Guam, from treasure-laden East India Company ships to ornate cathedrals, suddenly appeared fragile in the face of its own bloodline's collapse. Looking back, The image of Charles II is not merely that of a weak monarch defeated by illness, but a grim cautionary tale about power, warped by royal ambition. Every element of his biography, from his given name and parentage to vanished siblings, and his accession at 4 years old, contributes to the dark portrait of a sinking dynasty. In this half-dream of history, let your spirit drift into that silent chamber, where only the faint breath of a little prince echoes in the eyes of the world. From the moment he first opened his eyes, young Charles II found himself burdened with the fate of an empire. Before him, his elder brother, Prince Philip Prospero, had perished at the tender age of 4, and several other royal children had followed one another into untimely graves. The court watched each loss with growing dread, knowing that the Habsburg lineage teetered on the brink of extinction. In such a climate, the weight upon Charles's frail shoulders was immense. Not only was he expected to survive against all genetic odds, but also to father an heir who would preserve Habsburg dominion in Spain. Throughout his life, he entered into marriage twice. His first union was with Marie-Louise of Orléans, a match arranged to meld French and Spanish interests, yet tragically doomed to remain childless. Marie-Louise's death in 1689, under circumstances shrouded in whispers and rumour, only deepened the court's panic. In a desperate bid to secure succession, he then wed Maria Anna of Neuburg. But the physical frailty that plagued Charles rendered him incapable of fathering offspring, and Maria Anna too failed to bear him a child. By the close of 1700, the palace corridors echoed with frantic deliberations. Their final gambit would be to force the king, his body ravaged by illness, to sign a will naming his successor. This act, performed under conditions of extreme duress, ruptured the fragile unity of the court and pitted Austrian and French factions against one another in a bitter succession struggle. Ironically, the very strategy intended to cement Habsburg power into marriage among close relatives had backfired catastrophically upon its most vulnerable scion. Charles II's physical and mental weaknesses were plain for all to see. He suffered chronic epilepsy, periodic sleepwalking episodes, and bursts of erratic behaviour that left courtiers at a loss. As his health deteriorated, he became unable to walk, unaided, relying on servants to carry him from chamber to chapel. His protruding lower jaw made speech nearly impossible, and drool often ran down his chin in humiliating rivulets. Foreign diplomats, caught between horror and fascination, compared him to a living relic of Habsburg excess, a cautionary exhibit of genetic overreach. Under the relentless pressure of international diplomacy, the court resorted to any remedy that promised respite. Physicians bled him in hopes of rebalancing his humours, only to see his strength ebb further. Herbalists concocted bitter tonics, acupuncturists probed for hidden blockages, and alchemists offered mysterious elixirs to purify his blood. When natural medicine failed, some turned to occult practices. Whispered rumours spoke of necromancers invited into the Alcazar to commune with otherworldly forces. Priests attempted exorcism rites, convinced that malevolent spirits had claimed the king's body. Yet each experiment, each ritual, left Charles more exhausted, and the court more fractured. The relentless cycle of hope and disappointment took its toll on the king's psyche. He drifted in and out of coherence, at times gazing into empty corners, as though in conversation with unseen presences. At other moments, he would erupt into anguished sobs, lamenting the fate of a dynasty seemingly doomed by its own pedigree. Though he was sovereign in name, those closest to him recognized that he was but a marionette in a tragic puppet show, a symbol invoked to rally loyalty, even as his body crumbled. In the final months of his life, the campaign to extract a will reached fever pitch. Factions aligned with the Austrian claimant, Archduke Charles, pressed him gently to sign his name. Others, backing the rights of the French prince, demanded assurances of Philip of Anjou's succession. Each attempt saw his hand guided by wary scribes. The resulting signature, a shaky scrawl hardly legible as a royal command. These documents, produced under the fading strength of his reign, became the flashpoints for legal and military disputes that would ignite the War of Spanish Succession. Through it all, Charles II remained a figure of poignant pathos, the king who was never meant to be more than a regal infant, swaddled and crowned, now lay broken by the very alliances intended to fortify him. His life story, woven through with the threads of dynastic ambition, exemplified the cruel irony of a lineage that sought to protect itself through genetic insularity, only to unravel catastrophically from within. As we reflect on this chapter of history, it is impossible not to feel a heavy tenderness for the man behind the monarchy. He was a child forced into the glare of power, a husband whose body betrayed him, and a king whose destiny became a household drama of intrigue and desperation. In the dim hush of centuries past, his whispered struggles still echo reminders of how ambition, however well intended, can yield unforeseen ruin when carried to extremes. In the autumn of 1700, Charles II's fragile body entered its final, precipitous decline. Born with innate developmental challenges, he now resembled little more than skin stretched painfully over brittle bones. His legs, once capable of bearing even his slight frame, had weakened to the point that he could not stand without assistance. Walking required the steady grip of a cane or, more often, the careful support of two loyal attendants. Each step was a tremor, a prayer that he would not collapse again onto the cold marble floor. Meals became a torturous ordeal. Food dropped from his lips as though the act of eating were a distant memory. Swallows seized in his throat. His stomach, riddled with ulcerations and chronic inflammation, shuddered and refused to process even the simplest broth. Almost every morsel was swiftly returned in painful retching, leaving him gaunt and empty. Evening, the chamber echoed with the hollow sounds of agony. As the king's body fought against nourishment itself, his skin took on a waxen pallor that seemed unnatural, as though some unseen hand had drained its colour. His eyes bulged unnervingly beneath sunken sockets, and tufts of hair fell away in ragged patches, leaving sparse islands of scalp exposed. Seizures became nightly visitors, his muscles convulsed without warning, flinging him to the floor. Foam gathering at his lips, servants would rush to his side, only to find him thrashing and crying out to the darkness, speaking in fragmented sentences about spectral shapes that hovered at the foot of his bed. When he was lucid, the king muttered to invisible presences. He would rise unbidden, pacing the length of the chamber and shaking his arms at shadows that flickered across the stone walls. Guards patrolled in nervous circles, drawn by his anguished cries, and sometimes they found him bound by his own sheets. A desperate attempt to anchor himself against the unseen torment. The stench of decay followed him. No layer of perfumed oils or scented powder could vanquish the odour that clung to his skin like a curse. Visiting ambassadors recoiled in horror, convinced the rumours of diabolical possession were grimly real. The royal physicians, armed with the era's limited medical knowledge, found themselves powerless. Bloodletting, once a mainstay of treatment, only left him weaker. Laxatives and purgatives cleansed little but his dwindling strength. Herbal concoctions, some bitter as gall, offered fleeting hope that swiftly dissolved into further despair. Yet each remedy, each potion, proved ineffective against the army of ailments besieging his body. As nights grew into endless vigil, the king's sleeplessness became legendary. He would lie wide awake for days on end, eyes fixed on the ceiling, heart pounding with unexplained terror. Exhaustion settled deep into his bones, yet relief remained elusive. Each morning, pale and trembling, he would greet the new dawn as if it were a fresh torment, too weary even to muster a plea for mercy. In the face of such medical failure, the court, once proud of its physicians, turned to spiritual authority. The Vatican's shadow loomed large. The Inquisition's agents were summoned to assess whether supernatural forces had claimed the king's soul. Miguel Fernandez, The chief royal physician protested vehemently. He warned that these exorcism rites, replete with incantations and holy water, were more likely to hasten Charles's demise than to restore his health. Yet his cautions fell on ears, desperate for salvation. The palace chapel, no longer a sanctuary of quiet prayer, became an arena of ritual drama. Torches flickered on carved pews, while priests chanted Latin verses meant to banish malignant spirits. The king, strapped to his bed by leather straps, writhed as holy water sizzled upon his burning skin. Each session ended with him unconscious, his already feeble pulse barely detectable. The nobles in attendance would cross themselves, convinced that they witnessed a cosmic battle for their monarch's soul. Even as his body bore the fresh wounds of this gruesome theatre, outside the palace walls, news of these exorcisms travelled quickly. Protestant courts seized upon the spectacle as proof of Catholic superstition. French courtiers whispered that the Spanish had lost both mind and kingdom in their obsession with demons. In broadsheets and pamphlets, caricatures depicted the king as half-man, half-beast, convulsing before a cadre of chanting clerics. The scandal stung the Spanish court's pride, yet no one dared to halt the macabre proceedings. Within those echoing halls, the lines between healer and tormentor blurred. Physicians, sidelined by clerical authority, watched helplessly as the king's suffering assumed darker, more theatrical forms. The Inquisition's documentation grew thick with testimonies of supernatural strength and unknown tongues, fueling the belief that only divine intervention could salvage a monarch deemed lost to mortal medicine. Amid these horrors, the king's spirit flickered like a dying flame. At times he would whisper to a favoured page, describing dreams of sunlit fields and gentle breezes, images distant and unattainable. Other moments found him staring at his own reflection in a silver basin, as though questioning whether the frail figure before him was truly human. His laughter, once rare, became hollow profanity, a sound more chilling than any scream. And yet, in the darkest recesses of that palace, a faint, weary hope persisted. Some courtiers clung to the belief that even the gravest afflictions could be undone by faith. They held vigil each night, lighting candles and offering prayers at his bedside. Others, more cynical, counted the hours until his end, aware that the succession crisis loomed with each laboured breath he drew. In the end, the king's decline was not a single moment, but a painful unravelling, thread by thread, of body, mind, and myth. The man who had been crowned in infancy, whose life was shaped by dynastic ambition, now drifted between life and death, in a chamber heavy with incense and fear. His hollow eyes, once alight with youthful promise, mirrored the crumbling halls of an empire struggling to maintain its grandeur. Thus, as we recall these grim autumn nights of 1700, we glimpse not merely the physical deterioration of Charles II, but the unravelling of a dynasty in its death throes. Each trembling step, each failed remedy, and each desperate rite painted a portrait of a monarch whose final days became a cautionary tale about the limits of power, the frailty of flesh, and the spectre of desperation that can overtake even the mightiest of crowns. When all conventional medicine failed, the Spanish court turned its gaze toward the church. Late in October of 1700, the most respected members of the nobility and clergy were summoned to testify about the king's inexplicable nocturnal behaviour. They spoke in hushed tones of voices that were not his own echoes, that reverberated through his chambers like distant thunder. They recounted episodes in which his limbs bulged with sudden, inhuman strength during convulsions, as though a force beyond nature had taken possession of his flesh. Such accounts, delivered with trembling solemnity, pressed the ecclesiastical council to approve the most extreme measure, a formal exorcism to drive out whatever malignant spirit had ensnared the monarch. On a bitterly cold evening, within the vast, torchlit grandeur of the palace's private chapel. The ritual began. Charles II lay supine upon his gilt-framed bed, bound by thick leather straps to prevent self-injury. In the centre of the assembly stood Father Antonio Mariscialla, the church's foremost exorcist, his face lined with determined authority. Clad in sombre vestments, he intoned the ancient Latin prayers in a voice that trembled at first, but grew in strength with each recitation. As he sprinkled holy water upon the king, the liquid hissed against the fevered skin, sending tiny curls of steam into the chilled air. The pungent scent of burning incense curled in lazy spirals, filling the chamber with its cloying sweetness. Charles reacted at once, his eyes snapping open in wild terror. He screamed with a voice that shifted unpredictably, sometimes a high, plaintive whimper, like a frightened child. Then in the next breath, a guttural, bestial roar that shook the carved pews. The leather straps bit into his wrists as he threshed against them, and the assembled courtiers gasped in both horror and awe. News of this spectacle quickly spread through the courtyard. Corridors, the king was engaged in a struggle that transcended human understanding, pitting pious fervour against some unseen adversary within his very body. As the exorcism became an official court proceeding, nobles and prelates jockeyed for the best vantage in the chapel's galleries. Whispers passed from one to another. Some believed the ceremony would restore the king's health. Others feared it would hasten his final demise. When Charles emerged, momentarily lucid, his breathing steadied and his eyes cleared of terror, the court declared the ritual a success. Yet this fragile hope proved fleeting. Within hours, the king's body relapsed into its previous state of degradation, his limbs contorted, his breath ragged, his mind adrift in fevered visions. Word of these sacred rites spread like wildfire across Europe. In France, envoys found amusement in the reports. Spain is lost along with its king, they quipped, their letters laced with scorn. Elsewhere in Catholic realms, the exorcism was hailed as evidence of divine authority, a sign that God still wielded power over earthly maladies. In Protestant lands, however, the episode became a tool of propaganda. Brandished as proof of Catholic superstition run riot, pamphleteers published caricatures of the King of Spain entangled in chains, shrieking under the ministrations of chanting priests, their ink mocking the supposed sanctity of the ritual. Inside the palace, the lines between theologian and tormentor blurred alarmingly. Priests readied their crucifixes and relics as though preparing for battle, while the king's physicians, relegated to the periphery, watched with mounting dread. The sparse medical remedies they had once wielded lay abandoned, deemed irrelevant in the face of spiritual warfare. The chilling documentation compiled by the Inquisition grew thick with testimony of supernatural phenomena, voices, speaking languages unknown to any mortal ear, displays of prodigious strength during convulsions, and moments when the king seemed to hover halfway between the material world and some shadowy realm beyond. Despite the scandal and whispered skepticism, no member of the court dared to halt the exorcism. The gravity of the succession crisis loomed at every hearth and council table. Were they to admit that the king's affliction was purely physical? They risked undermining the very foundations of monarchical authority, an admission that a mere mortal ailment had brought the crown to its knees. Better to attribute his suffering to diabolical forces than to acknowledge the irreversible damage wrought by generations of insular bloodlines. In the hush that followed each ceremony, Charles II would lie motionless, his mind perhaps slipping closer to oblivion than to salvation. Courtiers would press their ears against the chamber doors, straining for the whisper of his breathing, waiting for any sign that the rites had achieved their intended purpose. When at last the candles guttered and died, the king's attendants would carry him back to his private chambers, his body limp and scarred from the ordeal. Thus, as the final days of Charles II unfolded, the line between faith and folly grew ever more indistinct. The court's recourse to exorcism, an act of desperation born of medical impotence, became both a symbol of unwavering devotion and a testament to the limits of human healing in that dimly lit chapel, bound by leather and fervent prayer. The monarch's suffering reached its most surreal crescendo, a man caught in the throes of a struggle that defied reason, and a kingdom grappling with the terrifying possibility that even the waning embers of divine intervention could not restore what nature itself had begun to extinguish. Amid this fevered court, the Austrian and French factions pressed ever more insistently upon the ailing king's hand. Both camps recognized that Charles II's weakened frame could scarcely endure long sessions at his writing desk. His signature, when scribbled at all, resembled a tremulous flourish, barely legible, even to the most patient eye. Knowing the fragility of his health, each party sought to secure its own candidate's claim, whispering promises of comfort or veiled threats of disgrace. The probability of forgery or coercion loomed large. A shaky scrawl under duress could tip the balance of a continent's destiny. Almost before his mortal breath had faded, the seeds of acrimony were sown, guaranteeing that his final testament would become the flashpoint for bitter dispute. At last, on the first day of November, in the year 1700, Charles II's final exhalation slipped away. The court observed the solemn rites of the Catholic Church. Prayers were whispered, candles snuffed, and mournful hymns filled the vaulted chamber. Yet political passions roiled beneath the surface. Rumours of his passing spilled beyond palace gates within hours, carried on horse and foot to every capital in Europe. By the third day of that bleak month, the physicians had performed a thorough post-mortem. Their findings were grim. His heart measured scarcely the size of a small child's fist, shriveled and darkened upon opening the chest. His lungs lay sodden with fluid and riddled with decay. Most appalling of all was the condition of his brain, withered, scarred by old hemorrhages, and far too small for a grown man. Other organs bore the unmistakable stench of rot, even while he yet lived. A tragic testament to the dire consequences of hereditary inbreeding. The moment the king's demise became public, embers of conflict ignited into open flame. The War of the Spanish Succession erupted almost immediately, dragging Europe into more than a decade of devastation. France rallied behind its chosen heir, Philip of Anjou, invoking the contested will that Charles II had signed in his waning days. Simultaneously, the Habsburg Emperor of Austria proclaimed his son as the rightful sovereign, citing both bloodline and the dubious legitimacy of the late king's testament. From the Pyrenees to the Low Countries, from the banks of the Rhine to distant enclaves in Italy, armies mobilized, alliances shifted, and battle standards were raised. The conflict would stretch across continents, foreshadowing modern global warfare. Naval powers strained at anchor ropes and scrubbed decks in anticipation of maritime contest. England and the Dutch Republic, fearing a Franco-Spanish union that might dominate the seas, lent their fleets to the Austrian cause. Their combined squadrons won key victories that secured vital trade routes and established British naval supremacy for generations to come. Merchant vessels that once plied the Mediterranean and Atlantic now flew Dutch or British flags, shifting the currents of commerce and political influence. The ebb and flow of war at sea would become defining chapters in the story of 18th century geopolitics. On land, too, the shifting map of Europe bore scars of the Succession War. Treaties and armistices, fragile as they were, redistributed territories among victors and vanquished alike. Spain's European position dwindled. While Austria gained footholds in the Low Countries and Italy, the French crown, though triumphant in some battlegrounds, was forced to temper its ambitions in order to secure Philip's tenuous claim to the Spanish throne. It was a period in which dynastic ambition, once thought absolute, encountered the practical limits of war and diplomacy. In the intellectual salons of Paris and London, the protracted conflict stirred fresh debates about sovereignty, legitimacy, and the nature of monarchical power. Philosophers and political theorists, many of them veterans of court intrigue, began to question the divine right of kings, and the morality of dynastic marriages. These reflections contributed to the awakening of Enlightenment thought, as reasoned discourse gradually supplanted superstition and hereditary privilege. By the time a final piece was stitched together in the first decades of the 18th century, the balance of power in Europe had been irrevocably altered. No longer would a single dynasty hold uncontested sway across the continent. Instead, a more complex tapestry of alliances, nation-states, and maritime empires emerged. The War of the Spanish Succession proved a crucible for modern statecraft, laying the groundwork for international relations as we understand them today. Thus, from the frail deathbed of a beleaguered king, an entire era of global conflict and philosophical re-evaluation was born. The demise of Charles II, whose suffering and contested legacy fueled one of the most consequential wars in European history, stands as a poignant reminder that the passage of a single life, no matter how confined by infirmity, can echo across generations, reshaping borders, societies, and the very course of human thought. On the 3rd day of November, in the year 1700, under the solemn watch of his two chief royal physicians, Dr. Miguel Fernandez and Dr. Antonio Jenga, the body of Charles II was subjected to a meticulous post-mortem. The first revelation struck every observer with profound shock. The king's heart, when removed from its chamber, was scarcely larger than the fist of a small child. It lay shriveled and blackened, resembling a piece of charred leather that had been left to parch in the sun, and it offered almost no evidence of having functioned as a living pump. Yet, it seemed nothing short of miraculous that this fragile organ had persisted in sustaining life for nearly 40 years. Balanced on a precarious thread between existence and extinction, examination of the monarch's lungs revealed a grim tableau of chronic disease. Each pulmonary cavity was engorged with fluid, and vast sections of tissue had succumbed to necrosis. This extensive decay provided a stark explanation for the king's persistent laboured breathing and the raspy, halting speech he managed in his final days. When the doctors turned their attention to his brain, they encountered a structure astonishing in its diminishment. The organ's volume was only equivalent to that expected of a child, and its surface betrayed numerous cysts and remnants of old hemorrhages. From the doctor's observations, it appeared that generations of inbreeding had stunted the brain's natural growth, depriving Charles of normal neurological development. The autopsy continued into the abdominal cavity, where the scene grew even more harrowing. The stomach bore extensive ulcerations, its lining eroded by years of suffering and perhaps compounded by the harsh herbs and repeated bloodletting he had endured. The intestines were thickened and inflamed, as though perpetually under siege, while his liver stood enlarged and fibrotic, a testimony to long-term poisoning from the various tinctures and leeches applied in vain. Such findings explained the appalling odour that had emanated from his person, even in the last weeks of his life, a stench of decay, as though parts of him had begun to decompose while he still breathed. Attention then turned to his skeletal frame. The spine was twisted into an unnatural curvature, and the ribcage bore unmistakable signs of deformation. His lower jaw jutted forward at a grotesque angle, rendering the simple act of chewing almost impossible and distorting his speech beyond comprehension. These skeletal anomalies, the physicians noted, had crushed any chance of normal function. No wonder the king spoke with such difficulty that even his closest advisors struggled to catch his meaning. Perhaps the most disturbing discovery of all was the state of several internal organs, which appeared to have entered a stage of putrefaction normally reserved for the hours after death. Some sections of tissue, the doctors recorded, smelled of decay so potent that it filled the chamber with an almost unbearable miasma. This premature decomposition, they concluded, accounted for the lingering foul odour that had followed Charles wherever he went, a hideous reminder of the genetic maladies that had plagued the Habsburg line. In their final report, the physicians marvelled. It is nothing short of extraordinary that this body sustained the spark of life for 39 years, yet they also lamented the cruelty of such a fate, noting that the suffering etched into every organ was testimony to a family's tragic obsession with preserving power through intermarriage. The full details of this medical dossier were swiftly locked away in the royal archives, guarded fiercely by courtiers, anxious to shield the monarchy's reputation from irreparable harm. Nevertheless, rumours of the grisly findings could not be contained. Within weeks, a copy of the autopsy report found its way into the hands of foreign powers, its contents spreading like wildfire through the diplomatic networks of Europe. For some courts, especially those poised to challenge Spanish claims, the document served as irrefutable evidence of a genetic calamity. The Habsburg dynasty's centuries-old strategy of close-kin marriage was laid bare for all to see, providing both moral justification and political cover for those ready to contest the Spanish succession. In Catholic capitals, the revelations ignited fierce debate. How could a royal house, so favoured by God, produce an heir so grievously afflicted among Protestant states? The report became propaganda. Gold pamphlets circulated, mocking the Catholic monarch's living decay, arguing that superstition and inbreeding had condemned him long before his reign's end. Even in more neutral territories, intellectuals and physicians pored over the medical details, sparking early discussions about genetics, heredity, and the perils of closed bloodlines. Despite its scandalous nature, the autopsy report was never formally published by the Spanish crown. Instead, it was whispered about behind closed doors and traded in secret correspondence, shaping European perceptions of Spain's weakening power. The tragic demise of Charles II, laid bare in the medical findings, became more than the end of a king's life. It was the lasting indictment of an entire dynasty's fatal design. In those early days of November, 1700, as Europe readied itself for the battles to come, the autopsy's horrors provided a sobering prelude to the War of the Spanish Succession. The evidence of decay, both moral and physical, fueled the ambitions of rival claimants and lent urgency to every diplomatic maneuver. And so, from the dissection table to the battlefields and conference rooms that would determine the continent's fate, the legacy of Charles II's doomed body echoed across the age. A chilling reminder of the price paid for power, pursued at the expense of nature's design. News of Charles II's final breath spread like wildfire across the capitals of Europe on that very night. Two great powers, France and Austria, stood poised to seize the moment. Louis XIV of France, ever the shrewd strategist, moved swiftly to lend his support to his grandson, Philippe d'Orléans, soon to be Philip V, invoking a will that French advocates claimed Charles II had signed in his last lucid moments. Across the Alps, the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I wasted no time in asserting that his son, Archduke Charles, was the true heir to the Spanish crown. He argued that Charles II's weakened mind, ravaged by illness and superstition, rendered any testament signed under such duress invalid. Within hours of the king's death, the French and Austrian embassies dispatched formal declarations to Madrid and to the Spanish vassal states, each demanding recognition of its preferred candidate. Troops were put on alert, war councils convened, and borders silently braced for the coming storm. By the end of that tumultuous week, what had been a whispered dispute became the War of the Spanish Succession. The first engagement occurred on the fields of the Spanish Netherlands on the 6th of November in 1700, marking the opening chapter of a conflict that would drag on for more than a decade. Europe, long a tapestry of shifting alliances, now cleaved along new fault lines, Protestant Britain and the Dutch Republic, wary of a potential Bourbon hegemony stretching from Paris through Madrid, threw their support behind the Austrian cause. They feared that a union of French and Spanish crowns under the Bourbons would upset the delicate equilibrium of power. Meanwhile, France, Spain, and many of the Spanish nobility rallied behind Philip V, eager to preserve their own privileges and to prevent Austrian overreach. Court intrigues and diplomatic maneuvers surged in tandem with the hoofbeats of cavalries and the creak of artillery. The battlegrounds were as varied as they were distant. In Europe, the fortified city of Gibraltar and the surrounding rocky peninsula became a coveted prize. Its control, offering command over the entrance to the Mediterranean, fleets of warships, rigging creaking, cannon mouths oiled in anticipation, clashed in the narrow straits. Further east, in the wide Mediterranean basin, islands such as Sardinia and Sicily felt the shock of cannonades and saw kingdoms change hands like cards in a gambler's game. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, colonial outposts in North America and the Caribbean teetered on the edge of rebellion and reprisal. Convoys laden with sugar, tobacco, and gold became targets for privateers commissioned by rival crowns. Port towns, once bustling with merchants and sailors, found their docks eerily silent as fear of naval bombardments and blockades took hold. Land battles, too, raged in disparate theatres. In the Low Countries, armies entrenched themselves along canals and fortified lines, hurling volleys of musket fire and grape shot across muddy fields. Highland regiments from Scotland, hired as mercenaries by England, marched shoulder to shoulder with Dutch pikemen, forging bonds even while cannonballs tore at their ranks. In Italy, the Alps acted as both barrier and conduit, with Austrian columns pushing south through narrow passes, while French allied Spanish forces defended mountain redoubts with desperation. Cities such as Milan and Turin changed hands, their once ornate palaces reduced to rubble or repurposed as military hospitals. Back on the home front, the war's financial toll was felt in every royal treasury. Tax collectors trudged through rain-battered villages, faces gaunt with worry, demanding ever higher levies to maintain armies in the field. Loans were sought from international bankers, who demanded interest rates as steep as the cliffs of Gibraltar. Coin shortages became commonplace, and in some regions, barter re-emerged as the only means of exchange. The ripple effects reached deep into the common populous grain shortages, sparked unrest in the streets of Madrid and Paris, and rumours of mutinies among unpaid soldiers sowed fear in every provincial governor's heart. Amid this turmoil, the philosophical salons of Paris and London brimmed with discussion. Enlightenment thinkers, many of them veterans of court intrigue, debated the war's deeper implications. Was it merely a dynastic quarrel? Or did it signify a shifting paradigm in which sovereign rulers would be held to account by emerging ideas of balance and reason? These salons, lit by flickering candles and filled with the murmur of discourse, became breeding grounds for new political theories that would shape the centuries to come. Despite the devastation, the war forged unexpected alliances and fostered a rudimentary sense of internationalism. Diplomats from Protestant and Catholic courts found themselves negotiating ceasefires and prisoner exchanges, their dialogues building early frameworks for what we now recognize as modern diplomacy. Treaties, though fragile, began to stipulate principles of collective security, hinting at the notion that certain conflicts ought to be resolved through negotiation rather than bloodshed. When, after more than a decade of bloodletting and brinkmanship, a series of treaties finally brought uneasy peace, the map of Europe bore the scars of conflict and the outlines of a new order. Spain's European territories shrank, while Austria gained strategic footholds in Italy and the Low Countries. France emerged with its prestige battered yet still formidable, and Britain began to claim its place as the preeminent naval power. The War of the Spanish Succession thus became a crucible in which the age-old struggle for monarchical dominance gave way to a more complex, multipolar balance of power. In the end, the death of Charles II, his frail body succumbing to the very legacy of dynastic inbreeding, sparked a conflict that reshaped continents and ushered in an era of shifting ideas, from Gibraltar's ramparts to the halls of the Vatican, from the Caribbean's palm-fringed islands to the intellectual salons of London. The echo of Charles's passing reverberated across the globe, and as the world drifted toward a new age of reason and statecraft, his final, troubled testament stood as a somber reminder that the legacies of kings endure far beyond their mortal coil. For better or for worse, as the guns fell silent on the European battlefields, the war's tremors rippled across the globe, setting economies awash in chaos. Spanish commerce ground to a near halt, treasure fleets laden with gold and silver from the New World, and the Philippines lay idle in reinforced harbours, their routes deemed too perilous by privateers and enemy cruisers. Merchants who once counted on steady shipments of bullion found their ledgers bereft of income, and the arteries of trade across the Atlantic and the Pacific clogged with uncertainty. In London and Amsterdam, the fallout was immediate. Spanish government bonds, once considered as secure as Gibraltar's rocks, plummeted in value as investors rushed to cut their losses. Banks heavily exposed to imperial debt collapsed under the strain, their vaults emptied by panicked withdrawals. States, strapped for cash, scrambled to borrow wherever they could, turning to foreign lenders at exorbitant interest rates. Back in Spain, the national treasury lay slack-jawed before the mounting expenses of sustaining armies abroad and repelling threats at home. Taxes climbed steeply, weighed upon the shoulders of weary farmers and embittered merchants alike. In the dusty villages of Andalusia and the rugged highlands of Galicia, peasant families bristled at the ducats demanded by tax collectors. Market towns that once thrummed with buyers and sellers now bore the hushed tension of unpaid levies. Across the Iberian landscape, murmurs of discontent grew louder, with each failing harvest and each toll imposed, setting the stage for social upheaval as the bottom tiers of society bore the brunt of a conflict they had not chosen. Far to the east, news of the Habsburg dynasty's decline kindled fresh designs among Ottoman governors and vassal princes. In the Ottoman heartlands and across Asian dependencies, the rumour mill churned with talk of weakening Spanish influence. Local chieftains and sultans, sensing new openings, shifted allegiances, vying for territorial gains once policed by Habsburg Spain, emboldened by the crown's distraction. Regional potentates carved out fiefdoms, their skirmishes creating fresh fault lines in areas already strained by earlier colonial ventures. Across the Atlantic, even the distant reaches of North America felt the war's pulse. The Anglo-Dutch alliance, intent on curbing French colonial power, launched raids on French settlements in Acadia and along the Hudson. Privateers, flying the red flag of St. George or the proud tricolour of the Dutch Republic, descended upon French trading posts, capturing vessels laden with furs and timber. In these contested frontiers, European rivalries turned into colonial calamities, as Native American nations were drawn unwillingly into alliances and enmities forged by rivals a world away. As French villages smouldered under cannon fire, indigenous communities found themselves caught between warring European powers, their lands and livelihoods jeopardized by decisions made in distant courts. Even Spain itself was rent by internal strife. In the northern provinces of Castile and Aragon, some traditionalist lords swore fealty to Philip V. Emboldened by Bourbon, promises of restored privileges, yet in Catalonia and parts of Valencia, voices arose in support of Archduke Charles, seeing in him a return to Habsburg stability and a bulwark against French centralization. Rival banners fluttered over the same city gates, sending confusion and fear through the populace. Pisans-Levis, already pressed by taxes, now found themselves conscripted into militias to defend their villages from opposing bands of noble retainers. Markets emptied as townsfolk locked their doors, uncertain whether the next knock would herald a tax collector or a rebel horseman demanding oaths. Caught between the foe at home and the enemy overseas, the royal court struggled to marshal forces for both internal pacification and external defence. Royal edicts called up contingents from Andalusian plains and Basque valleys, even as communications faltered and roads fell into disrepair. Nobles who owed service to the crown now interpreted their duties as defending hearth and home rather than fighting distant battles. Soldiers, wearied by the stench of foreign encampments and the fevered nights of European campaigns, found themselves redeployed to quell disorders in their native provinces. Peasant sinew, already frayed by toil under the sun, was taxed anew to carry pikes and powder kegs into skirmishes among countrymen. Meanwhile, trade with the New World, once the lifeblood of Spanish finances, lay nearly dormant. Caribbean sugar plazas, once bright with sails and drums of commerce, now echoed to the lonely creak of abandoned docks. Manila galleons, laden with silken spices, waited in guarded harbours for safe passage. Merchants in Seville and Cadiz watched their warehouses fill with unsold wares. The gold coins they once banked, now scarce enough to gild only a handful of coins for royal coffers. As the war dragged on, the strain on everyday Spaniards grew unbearable. Rumours of mutiny surfaced in garrison towns, where unpaid soldiers drifted into taverns rather than muster in battle lines. Famine stalked rural communities as food supplies, diverted for army provisioning, became scarce. Social unrest, once confined to hushed conversations in village squares, spilled into open revolt in some regions. In Andalusia, peasants burned tax records in defiance. In Navarre, cloaked rebels raided estates of lords. They deemed complicit in the inequality wrought by war. Yet even amid the darkness, whispers of hope flickered. Some reform-minded courtiers, aghast at the devastation across empire and home, began to question the old order. They argued that endless dynastic wars drained the realm of its lifeblood, and that Spain's future lay in rebuilding commerce, reforming taxes, and tempering monarchical excess. These voices, though quiet at first, took root in intellectual circles of Toledo and Salamanca, sowing seeds that would later sprout into more daring calls for change. In the end, the global scale of the conflict laid bare the interconnectedness of empires and economies, from the silver-laden ships of Acapulco to the caravan routes of Anatolia, from the sun-drenched fields of Andalusia to the wind-whipped coasts of New England. The War of the Spanish Succession wove a tapestry of hardship and upheaval. Every coin spent on musket balls, every burden of tax imposed upon the peasant, every battlefield where musketeers fell, echoed across continents, in a tragic testament to the price of dynastic ambition. And so, as Europe slowly staggered toward peace, the reminder of those war-torn years lingered in the silent warehouses of Cadiz, in the hollow treasuries of Madrid, and in the whispered curses of villagers who bore scars both visible and unseen. For the war's true legacy was not only the shifting lines on the map, but the profound economic and social wounds it inflicted, wounds that would take generations to heal under the weary sun of a Europe forever changed. In the wake of Charles II's public exorcism and the gruesome revelations of his post-mortem, the learned circles of Europe found themselves in restless debate. From Paris to Padua, scholars and philosophers spoke in hushed tones about what they had witnessed: rituals invoking demons, organs that had rotted in life, and a monarch whose decay seemed to symbolize the rot at the heart of feudal superstition. Figures such as Voltaire and Montesquieu seized upon the affair as a potent example of the dangers inherent in unquestioned religious authority and blind monarchical power. In their writings, they contrasted the archaic spectacle of exorcism with the promise of rational inquiry, arguing that faith in the divine right of kings had blinded entire societies to the benefits of science and reason. Voltaire, ever the sharp satirist, pointed out the absurdity of summoning priests to battle unseen devils while neglecting physicians who could have provided more humane treatments. He wrote that if demons truly existed, they must have mourned the chance for simple bloodletting or herbal remedies before enduring the indignity of holy water and Latin incantations. Montesquieu, meanwhile, used the Spanish case to illustrate how absolute power, whether wielded by popes or princes, stifled individual freedom and rational thought. He suggested that no institution, however venerable, should be immune from scrutiny. and that the well-being of subjects demanded a scientific approach to both body and society. Across the Atlantic, in the academic hubs of England and the Dutch Republic, avid presses began to print every scandalous detail. Newspapers in London ran serialized accounts of the contested will, describing the near-illegible scrawl that had cast a pall of suspicion over Philip V's claim. Pamphleteers in Amsterdam, capitalizing on Protestant disdain for Catholic ritual, published lengthy transcripts of the autopsy report, complete with translations of medical terminology and eyewitness commentary. These publications stirred public outrage. Why should a king's private sufferings serve as mere spectacle for the powerful? While the common man remained at the mercy of shoddy healers and corrupt clerics, the clamour for reform grew louder with each edition. Merchant guilds in Rotterdam called for standards in public health, demanding that city hospitals adopt the latest anatomical knowledge rather than rely on ancient humoral theories. In London's coffee houses, merchants and craftsmen debated the ethics of inbreeding among Europe's royal families, pointing to Charles II's shattered body as a cautionary example. They urged universities to introduce systematic study of genetics, then understood as heredity, as well as rigorous training in dissection and pathology. It was no longer acceptable, they thundered, to revere tradition over truth. Meanwhile, families across the British Isles found in the Spanish debacle an argument for limiting ecclesiastical authority. Clergy had once sat above criticism, but news of priests binding a king to his bed for days on end, stripping him of dignity under the guise of spiritual cleansing, galvanized calls for a separation between church ceremonies and medical treatments. Petitions circulated in provincial towns, asking that local parishes fund basic medical care and anatomical training for surgeons, rather than relying solely on exorcists and extempore miracle cures. The Dutch Estates General, in turn, passed motions encouraging universities in Leiden and Utrecht to expand their faculties of medicine, insisting that future physicians receive dissection licenses and access to cadavers for study. On the continent, the royal universities of Padua and Bologna, long bastions of medieval medical teaching, felt the pressure as well. Professors who once clung to Galenic doctrine found their lectures under fire from students keen to learn of the latest findings in human anatomy. In a bold move, the University of Padua announced new courses in comparative anatomy, heredity, and the dangers of consanguineous marriage, a topic once taboo among Europe's nobility. Senate meetings in Venice recorded heated debates about whether marriages between close kin should be subject to legal restrictions, citing the tragic example of Charles II as undeniable proof of genetic peril. Even in Spain, where royal censors initially suppressed the most damning evidence, the tide of public sentiment could not be held back. Secret societies of reform-minded physicians and lawyers exchanged clandestine treatises questioning the Inquisition's role in medical matters. They drafted proposals urging King Philip V's court to establish a National Academy of Science, free from clerical oversight. Such ideas, once unthinkable, gained traction among moderate nobles, weary of the kingdom's economic collapse and haunted by memories of their late monarch's suffering. By the late years of the conflict, when provisional peace treaties allowed scholars to reconvene, the reverberations of Charles II's final days still echoed through lecture halls and salons. Debates raged over whether the study of human decay could ever be separated from moral considerations, and whether the Church should be stripped of its monopoly on life and death matters. Enlightenment minds argued that every body, royal or peasant, deserved the dignity of scientific care, and that reason, not superstition, must guide the healing arts. Thus, from the dimly lit chamber of an exorcism to the austere anatomy theatre, the tragic end of Charles II catalyzed a transformation in European thought. What began as the grotesque spectacle of a dying king became a clarion call for rational medicine, scientific freedom, and the dismantling of unchecked spiritual authority. In sleepy villages as in bustling capitals, the conversation shifted. Irrevocably, no crown, no creed, No tradition could stand above the humble scalpel or the clear light of reason. And in that gentle but relentless shift toward enlightenment, the legacy of Charles's torment found its ultimate redemption, a world inching awake from the long nightmare of fear and ignorance. The passing of Charles II stands as a grim testament to the perils of placing dynastic ambition above the well-being of a people. His life, and especially his agonizing end, revealed in stark relief the genetic hazards that arise when royal bloodlines are closed off by repeated intermarriage. The Habsburg dynasty did not crumble solely because of strategic matrimonial alliances gone awry. It also fell victim to an absolutist regime that dismissed the council of medical practitioners in favor of arcane rites and autocratic whims. In Charles's final months, every failed remedy and every torture-like exorcism exposed the ruthless machinery of power where a human life, reduced by illness and superstition, was valued less than political advantage. For almost 40 years, Charles had borne the cumulative weight of his forebears' choices, a fragile body beset by congenital deformities, a mind clouded by fits and seizures, and a court that preferred the spectacle of exorcism to the science of cure. His public unravelling, seen in the blood-stained sheets of ritual ceremonies and the odious findings of his autopsy, laid bare the extent to which absolutism could trample expert opinion. Physicians who warned of the damage wrought by inbreeding and who advocated more humane treatments were sidelined, while theologians claimed dominion over his body and soul. Such disregard for empirical advice undermined not only Charles's chance of survival, but also the integrity of the state that relied on his health to maintain stability. The Habsburg collapse, therefore, was not merely a political or military failure, it was also a profound moral and scientific catastrophe. A case study in what happens when superstition overrides reason. The very structures meant to safeguard the monarchy, its archives of genealogical records, its sacred rituals, its paternalistic governance, ultimately facilitated the unravelling of both king and kingdom. In place of prudent governance, guided by specialist knowledge, the court offered exorcisms and purges, allowing the king's body to decay under the gaze of courtiers more concerned with omens than organs. Yet the lessons drawn from Charles II's life and death extend far beyond 17th century Spain. Over the ensuing centuries, his tragic story has served as a cautionary parable for all nations. It underscores the necessity of respecting scientific expertise and safeguarding genetic diversity within human populations. When bloodlines become excessively narrow, whether by choice or by compulsion, the risk of hereditary disorders and catastrophic health outcomes rises dramatically. Charles II's fate thus echoes through time, as a warning political expediency should never trump the careful stewardship of public health. Moreover, the Habsburg example reminds us of the dangers inherent in unchecked authority. Absolute power, unchecked by expert voices or institutional checks, creates a fertile ground for neglect and cruelty. In modern parlance, the governance of any society must balance the prerogatives of leadership with the insights of specialists, whether in medicine, environmental science, or social welfare. The medieval court that bound its king with leather straps believed itself to be safeguarding divine order. We, in turn, must guard against allowing dogma or unchallenged tradition to eclipse the advances of empirical research. Finally, Charles II's life and demise call upon contemporary societies to honour the value of every human being. Regardless of status, his body, reduced to living rot by political manoeuvring and religious zeal, became a symbol of how human dignity can be sacrificed at the altar of power. 200 years later, his memory still resonates as an admonition. True civilization measures itself not by the grandeur of its thrones, but by the health and freedom of its citizens. In the end, Charles II was far more than a tragic monarch. He was the harbinger of a universal lesson, absolute rule, unswayed by the voices of science and conscience. Inevitably sows the seeds of its own demise, both humanitarian and political. By remembering his story, we renew our commitment to a governance that cherishes knowledge, diversity, and compassion above all else, ensuring that no leader's life need ever again serve as a cautionary relic of power's darkest temptations. As the War of the Spanish Succession dragged into its later years, Spain found itself more a battleground than a unified kingdom. Internal fault lines deepened ominously. In Castile and Andalusia, many of the grandees threw their lot in with Philip V, hoping that allegiance to the Bourbon crown would secure French military protection for their estates and preserve their standing at court. Meanwhile, in Catalonia and Aragon, suspicion of French intervention ran deep. Local lords and urban councils shifted their loyalty to the Austrian claimant, viewing him as a bulwark against what they saw as French hegemony. As these rival allegiances took root, armed bands, sometimes official militias, sometimes ragged insurgent companies sprang up across the countryside, pillaging haciendas and disrupting harvests. Fields lay untilled as fear kept peasants from the plough, and heavy levies drained what little remained of their subsistence. In many rural districts, this chaos gave rise to rudimentary war. Communes, self-styled assemblies where villagers elected provisional councils to defend their homes from both marauders and rogue soldiers. These makeshift communities, bound by local custom rather than royal decree, sought to maintain order and share meagre resources, a testament to the desperation of a populace caught between warring nobles. At the same time, Spain's great cities, Madrid, Seville, Barcelona, were transformed into military fortresses. Once celebrated capitals of culture and commerce, they were now riven by smoke and shot, their streets echoing with the clang of arms. Dockyards that had shipped silk and spices fell silent. Instead, they bristled with cannon emplacements and served as billet for alternating contingents of French and Austrian marines. Grand palaces, once draped in silken banners, were commandeered as barracks. Cathedral plazas became parade grounds for infantry drills. The central government, paralyzed by factional intrigue, drifted from one stronghold to another. After initial attempts to govern from Madrid proved untenable, the court fled to Valencia, only to find itself besieged in turn. A hasty retreat to Zaragoza followed, leaving behind a trail of abandoned archives and scattered bureaucrats. Finally, the exiled court convened in Valladolid, its treasury all but empty, and its administration reduced to a handful of weary clerks. Each relocation inflicted fresh wounds on the kingdom's cohesion. Crucial documents were lost or destroyed. Regional tax revenues failed to reach the treasury, and the once robust civil service collapsed into disarray. Throughout this turmoil, the ordinary Spaniard languished in limbo, longing for a cessation of hostilities, even as real power slipped into the hands of colonial commanders and local commissars. This disintegration went beyond mere politics. It penetrated the very fabric of Spanish culture. In cities and towns alike, the familiar rhythms of Castilian speech were increasingly overlaid by French and German, stamped into the tongues of occupying officers and their administrative cadres. Tapas bars, once humming with local dialects, now sat silent as foreign tongues echoed in the plazas. Artisans, once proud bearers of a Spanish tradition stretching back centuries, found themselves outflanked by foreign suppliers and legal codes that privileged imported produce. In churches, the liturgy retained its Latin core, yet sermons were delivered by priests subservient to foreign bishops, whose commands bore the accent of distant courts. Thus did a once vast empire unravel from within. Fields lay fallow, trade routes lay bare, and the majestic continuity of Habsburg rule fragmented under the weight of civil strife. A kingdom that had spanned continents, whose flag had flown from American colonies to Philippine harbors, shrank into a patchwork of cantons and fiefdoms. The ruined armories and shuttered foundries bore witness to an empire unmoored, not destroyed by a single battle, but corroded by internal division and the erosion of central authority. In this protracted agony, one sees a cautionary tale writ large. Even the mightiest realms can collapse when they neglect the harmony of domestic unity and balanced diplomacy. Without such balance, the proud edifices of state, its institutions, its culture, its very language can be swiftly overwhelmed by competing forces, both within and without. As Spain's grand chapter under the Habsburgs closed, it left behind a realm splintered by loyalty and language, its people weary from years of conflict and longing for a peace that seemed forever distant. In the flickering lamplight of that troubled epoch, the lesson emerged starkly. An empire's endurance depends not only on its armies and alliances, but on the solidarity of its people and the wisdom of its governance. As the War of the Spanish Succession ground on, hundreds of thousands of civilians found themselves ripped from their fields and forced into flight. In the northern reaches of Navarra, Catalonia, and Valencia, peasants abandoned the olive groves and vineyards they had tended for generations. Packing what little they could carry, perhaps a battered earthenware jug, a small sack of seed grain, and setting out on foot through tangled forests and over craggy mountain passes toward the relative safety of southern France and the Italian Piedmont. The roads they followed were long and perilous. Many succumbed to the relentless march of disease typhus. Smallpox and plague swept through columns of refugees, weakened by hunger. Others fell victim to roving bands of soldiers and bandits who stripped them of clothing and shoes before vanishing into the night. By the time these weary travellers staggered into port cities such as Cadiz or Barcelona, they were often little more than emaciated shadows of their former selves. Coastal docks, once alive, with merchant ships and naval vessels, became choke points for disembarking refugees. Makeshift shanty towns sprang up along the sea wall, ramshackle dwellings of driftwood and patched canvas, where thousands huddled together in the hope of finding relief. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, while typhoid and dysentery ran rampant through these overcrowded quarters. Relief efforts led by the Catholic Church tried to fill the gap, distributing bread crusts and thin broth, but the charity of cloistered orders and local confraternities could not keep pace with the tide of need. With scant resources, these organizations struggled even to inoculate the most vulnerable. Women traveling with small children often became ensnared by traffickers, promising safe passage inland, only to be sold into servitude or prostitution. Local authorities, overwhelmed by the scale of the crisis, imposed curfews and martial decrees in an attempt to forestall rioting and crime. Soldiers patrolled the narrow alleys by torchlight, their boots echoing on cobblestones wet with an autumn drizzle. Yet disorder persisted. Desperate refugees clashed with guards, and in some districts, vigilante bands formed to steal food from poorly guarded storerooms. Even as the war's cannon thundered in distant valleys, the home front felt its own siege, as starvation and destitution battered communities long accustomed to stability. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Spain's American territories suffered their own calamities. In Lima, the silver mines of Potosi, once the pulsing heart of imperial wealth, ran low on shipments of ore. As the mother country's demand shifted to war coffers, local merchant houses, reliant on the steady flow of precious metals, found their warehouses bare and credit lines evaporated. The sight of empty bullion chests in the Royal Mint created panic among Creoles and Peninsulaires alike. In Veracruz and Campeche, the West Indies fleets loaded with gold and silver failed to materialize, prompting violent protests in the plazas, where viceroys had once been hailed as conduits of prosperity. Citizens' flower sellers, mule drivers, shopkeepers took to the streets, chanting for relief and the return of prosperous times. In the highlands, indigenous communities, long subjected to onerous tribute and forced labor in silver mines, seized the moment. A series of localized uprisings flared around Potosi, Tsusco, and Huancavelica, as native miners and peasant farmers banded together to seize control of production sites and sugar haciendas. These revolts, though quickly suppressed by colonial militias, underscored the fragility of Spain's New World domains. Confronted with this multi-front disaster, English and Dutch merchants saw opportunity. They organized what came to be known as refugee convoys, small fleets that skirted Spanish patrols along the Atlantic seaboard, carrying provisions and passage for those fleeing Iberian chaos toward the British and Dutch colonies in North America. In Boston and New York, taverns and warehouses were pressed into service as temporary barracks, while local magistrates hastily passed bills facilitating land grants for settlers. The arrival of Spanish exiles, farmers, craftsmen, soldiers helped to diversify the ethnic composition of port towns like Charleston and Philadelphia, laying early foundations for the multicultural societies that would blossom in the 18th century. Similarly, Dutch officials in New Amsterdam extended privileges to those bearing a passport from British or French ports, seeking to bolster their own struggling colonies on Manhattan Island and along the Hudson River. This influx of refugees and commodities heralded a profound shift in Atlantic geopolitics. Spain's once formidable monopoly over transoceanic trade began to crumble as its American territories looked to alternative markets in London, Amsterdam, and the Caribbean aboard English and Dutch vessels. Those ships carried not only grain and flour, but also news of a Spain beset by internal collapse, prompting further migration as families sought refuge across the water. Plantation economies in the West Indies adapted to the new realities, importing enslaved labourers and indentured servants from Britain and France to replace the dwindling Spanish workforce. Sugar, tobacco, and later rice found their way into European markets through Dutch and English re-export, bypassing the outdated Casa de Contratación. Thus, the human cost of 40-odd years of warfare became entangled with the rise of new colonial networks. The old patterns where silver from Potosi fueled Spanish galleons and gold shipments underwrote Habsburg armies gave way to a more plural trade regime in which no single power held unchallenged sway. The social fabric of the Atlantic world was rewoven, dislocated. Spaniards became settlers in Carolina. Catalan artisans found refuge in Marseille. Navarrese farmers established communities in Provence. In each instance, the scars of conflict left new cultural imprints, blending Iberian customs with local practices, and seeding the pluralism that would define the modern Americas. In the end, the Spanish succession's refugee crisis and economic collapse proved pivotal not just for Spain, but for the emergence of a truly international Atlantic economy. As Spain's grip slackened, other powers expanded their reach, transforming the war's human tragedy into the reluctant catalyst for transatlantic migration, colonial diversification, and the ultimate decline of Spanish mercantile monopoly. In these shifting sands, the story of those dispossessed by war became woven into the larger tapestry of Atlantic history, illuminating how human flows born of calamity can reshape the course of nations and continents alike. After more than a decade stained with the blood of soldiers and civilians alike, the great powers at last found themselves utterly drained. In the year 1713, weary negotiators from England, the Dutch Republic, France, and Austria gathered in the city of Utrecht to craft a peace that would draw a line under the conflict. Spain itself, steeped in mourning for its late monarch and fractured by internal strife, did not attend the talks directly, yet the terms agreed they would reshape the map of Europe and set precedents for international law. Under the Treaty of Utrecht, each signatory secured concessions that reflected centuries of rivalry and exhaustion. England emerged with Gibraltar and the island of Minorca, strategic outposts on the gateway between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. The English navy, humming with renewed purpose, could now guard the narrow straits and threaten rival shipping lanes. The Dutch, ever mindful of the balance of military power on the continent, obtained guarantees that their territories in the Spanish Netherlands would be reorganized under Austrian rule, preserving a neutral buffer against French expansion. Austria, in turn, received the previously Spanish-controlled southern provinces of the Netherlands, what we might think of now as modern-day Belgium and the Kingdom of Naples in Italy, extending Habsburg influence in the Mediterranean while compensating for its diminishing sway in Iberia. France, having borne the brunt of coalition warfare, accepted terms that simultaneously humbled and reassured. It formally recognized Philip V as King of Spain, thus acknowledging the Bourbon succession in Madrid, yet agreed to a strict prohibition against any future political union between the French and Spanish crowns. This clause, like a carefully etched line in sand, was meant to guard against the very threat that had driven much of the earlier conflict, the rise of a Franco-Spanish superstate. In return, France regained certain trade privileges in the Spanish Caribbean, but relinquished claims on Spanish European domains, effectively curbing its own ambitions. For Philip V, the treaty offered a lifeline. Despite the loss of Spain's remaining European possessions, lands of lower economic worth than the vast American colonies, yet potent symbols of empire, he retained the Spanish crown and the loyalty of many in the peninsular nobility. The cost was steep, but survival mattered more than glory. In the wake of Utrecht, the Bourbon dynasty in Spain undertook sweeping reforms modelled on the French system. Administrative divisions were reorganized to improve governance. Tax collection, long hobbled by antiquated privileges and local exemptions, was overhauled to fill empty treasures, and the Spanish army was restructured with French-style regiments, uniforms, and training. These changes laid the groundwork for the Bourbon modernization of Spain, bringing it tentatively in step with its northern neighbour. Thus, Utrecht did more than end a war. It inaugurated a new epoch of European statecraft. The principle of a balance of power, long whispered among courtiers and scholars, emerged from the treaty's careful calibrations. No single dynasty would be allowed to dominate the continent unchecked. A system of alliances, counterweights, and diplomatic congresses would henceforth guide relations among kingdoms, with treaties like Utrecht serving as key reference points. Moreover, the treaty codified the idea that dynastic changes could be tolerated so long as they did not upset the fragile equilibrium. A prince might ascend a foreign throne, but any attempt to unify crowns or build an undue advantage would be met with collective resistance. In practical terms, the Treaty of Utrecht established the first real framework for European cooperation. Ambassadors and envoys from the signatory powers committed to uphold its conditions, and periodic meetings would follow to handle disputes. This embryonic concert of states, though imperfect and often violated, set a precedent for the modern concept of an international order, governed by treaties and common interest, rather than sheer conquest. It also tacitly recognized that war, however destructive, must be bounded by clear rules to prevent endless cycles of violence. Back in Spain, the peace spelled the beginning of recovery. The Bourbon reforms, unpopular among some traditional elites, gradually brought renewed stability. Roads and postal routes were improved, facilitating communication across the kingdom. A centralized treasury began to replenish itself, drawing on more equitable tax bases. The army, once scattered and demoralized, reorganized under officer corps, trained by French veterans. Over the following decades, Spain would cautiously re-emerge as a player on the European stage, albeit one mindful of the costs of overreach. And so, as the candles guttered in the taverns of Utrecht and the last quills dried on treaty parchments, a war that had consumed a generation came to an end, and a new order quietly took its place. The grandeur of dynastic claims was tempered by the sober calculus of balance. Diplomacy, no less deadly than the muskets fired on distant battlefields, had proven its worth in preserving a measure of peace. From this peace sprang an understanding that the fate of kingdoms and the lives of countless souls depended as much on the delicacy of a treaty signing as on the valor displayed in the heat of battle. In those dimly lit conference rooms, Europe laid the foundations for a century of shifting alliances, naval rivalries, and Enlightenment thought, all shadowed by the knowledge that the balance of power would always be fragile, and that fragile peace, a treasure to guard with vigilance and restraint. Although Spain emerged from the Treaty of Utrecht diminished in European territory, the new Bourbon monarchy, under Philip V, refused to accept defeat as fate. With a heavy, yet determined hand, the king and his closest advisors inaugurated what came to be known as the Bourbon reforms. Their aim was nothing less than a full-scale revitalization of the Spanish state, a transformation of its ancient, creaking institutions into a modern, centralized apparatus, capable of reclaiming prestige, restoring maritime security, and shielding the American empire from foreign rivals. At the heart of this program lay the centralization of authority. Gone were the days when powerful aristocratic families wielded autonomous power in distant provinces. Instead, candor and competence became the criteria for royal appointment. Charters, granting tax exemptions and judicial privileges, were revoked, and a new corps of administrators chosen for their proven ability, rather than noble birth, was dispatched to oversee taxation, justice, and public works throughout the peninsula. These men of service, often educated at the royal academies in Madrid or Alcalá, reported directly to the Council of Castile, ensuring that local governance aligned with the Crown's vision rather than with entrenched local interests. The military, too, underwent a sweeping overhaul, inspired by France's vaunted arms. Under the guidance of veteran officers who had served under Louis XIV, Spain raised permanent infantry and artillery regiments, each bound to rigorous drilling schedules and standardized equipment. Gone were the irregular levies called at a moment's notice. In their place stood professional battalions whose soldiers received regular pay, proper uniforms, and medical attention. Artillery parks were established in key border fortresses, Pamplona, Jaca, and Zaragoza, housing standardized cannons and expertly trained gunners. The result was a standing army, no longer a mercurial force of feudal levies, but a reliable instrument of state policy. Maritime revitalization represented another cornerstone of the Bourbon agenda, recognizing that naval power underpinned both imperial defense and commercial dominance. The Crown invested heavily in shipbuilding. Dockyards at Cartagena and Cadiz were expanded and modernized. Their slipways extended to accommodate ships of the line and frigates alike. Spanish shipwrights, partnering with French naval engineers, introduced new hull designs and rigging techniques. At sea, a reconstituted Spanish fleet began regular patrols of the Atlantic shipping lanes, escorting treasure convoys from the Americas and warding off privateers. Naval academies were established in Cadiz, where midshipmen studied navigation, gunnery, and seamanship under skilled instructors. Over time, these changes restored a measure of Spain's once legendary maritime prowess, helping to protect colonial trade routes that had long been vulnerable. Yet the Bourbon reforms did not stop at Spain's shores. Across the Atlantic, the Crown sought to wring greater efficiency and revenue from its American holdings, especially the lucrative silver mines of Peru and Mexico. In Lima and Mexico City, new viceroys took office with clear mandates to increase production and tighten fiscal oversight. A specialized Council of the Indies was empowered to supervise colonial trade, ensuring that merchants could no longer evade royal duties through illicit contraband or local favoritism. This council standardized tariffs, regulated shipping schedules, and mandated that colonial goods, whether silver, cocoa, or cochineal, pass through official ports en route to Europe. The resulting increase in customs revenue proved vital for the first time in decades. The royal treasury saw a more reliable flow of funds, reducing the need to borrow abroad at crippling interest rates. Naturally, these reforms provoked backlash among the entrenched colonial elites. Creole merchants in port cities, accustomed to operating with virtual autonomy, bristled at the new regulations. In the Andes, mine owners who had long skimped on royal dues found themselves pressured to deliver silver at the mandated quotas or face severe penalties. Rebellions flared briefly in Seville and Veracruz as local interest groups resisted the tightening of fiscal controls. Yet the Crown was resolute. Through a combination of judicious concessions and firm enforcement, it managed to quell opposition without igniting full-scale revolt. Over the ensuing years, the cumulative effect of these changes became clear. Spain's central government, once hobbled by feudal fragmentation, gained coherence and direction. The professional army, disciplined and well supplied, stood ready to defend the realm's frontiers. The revitalized navy shielded commerce from predation, allowing silver and other colonial exports to flow with fewer interruptions. And the newly empowered Council of the Indies delivered more predictable revenues, helping to fund Spain's European obligations without plunging the realm ever deeper into debt. Thus, the Bourbon reforms, though born of the humiliation of territorial loss, laid the foundations for a modern Spanish state. They reflected a deliberate shift away from the medieval fiefdoms of old toward a bureaucratic monarchy guided by reason and expertise. While they could not erase the scars of years of war, they did create the institutional resilience necessary for Spain to reassert itself as a maritime power and to guard its far-flung empire. In that half-lit dawn of the 18th century, the Bourbon monarchs proved that even a humbled state could find renewal through systematic reforms, provided its rulers were willing to embrace centralization, meritocracy, and the disciplined application of knowledge gained from abroad. In this sleepy awakening of Spain's fortunes, one glimpses the quiet power of governance reformed, and the promise of an empire reborn under the steady hand of enlightened sovereignty. As we drift toward the end of our hushed exploration into the final days of Spain's last Habsburg monarch, it's clear that this video offers more than the mere recounting of ghastly exorcism, rites, and autopsy horrors. Beneath the lamplight of narrative detail lies a richer vein of meaning, the transformative promise of enlightened reform. Charles II's agonizing demise, so meticulously portrayed, serves as an allegory for the perils of power divorced from compassion and reason. Yet, out of that bleak tableau emerges the bright arc of renewal, when Philip V and his ministers seized the moment to enact the Bourbon reforms, breathing new vitality into a battered realm. This duality of collapse, followed by revival, gives this video its deepest resonance. Here, in the faint glow of the screen, we grasp how even the most entrenched structures can be reformed when leaders embrace merit, modernity, and the better angels of human judgment. By following this narrative, viewers learn that no institution, however venerable, should be immune to scrutiny or insulated from expert counsel. The exorcisms that failed to heal the king's flesh starkly contrast with the scientific and administrative overhauls that later restored national stability. Watching these events unfold, we appreciate the critical lesson that faith without reason can victimize the vulnerable, while reason without conscience may ignore the human heart. The video encourages us to cherish a governance style that marries empathy with expertise, a model that honors both the individual citizen and the collective good. It is a quiet yet powerful admonition to remain vigilant against any ideology or tradition that would override evidence or silence dissent. As the imagery of trooping battalions and bustling American silver mines fades, what remains is the enduring message that history's darkest moments can catalyze progress. The story of Spain's rise, fall, and rebirth shows how societies can emerge stronger when they confront their failures head-on. In this way, the video's greatest gift to its audience is the reassurance that reconstruction is possible, even after catastrophic loss. We leave with the comforting notion that, though we may slumber through the ages, history's waking call can rouse us to action, urging each one of us to apply the lessons learned from centuries past to the challenges of our own time. May this closing reflection encourage viewers to remain curious, to question inherited assumptions, and to cultivate a world in which compassion and competence walk hand in hand, ensuring that no one's suffering becomes a mere footnote in the annals of power.